Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MythVision. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. It wasn't long ago that I interviewed Nina Livesey about her book, The Letters of Paul in the Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. This book has stirred up controversy. It created Twitter wars between me and people that got along pretty decent. But of course, I was accused of jumping on any and every conspiracy and any extreme position possible, because that's what MythVision does, right? Tomorrow, the Apostle Paul was a turtle, and MythVision is going to interview an academic to prove to you the kind of turtle that the Apostle Paul was. It's really unfortunate that the very people that accuse me of being a conspiracy-minded lunatic online for entertaining hypotheses that the Apostle Paul may have been a literary figure, when it is consensus critical scholarship that the Apostle Paul, written in the book of Acts, is a role player, a player that is clearly playing a role in a story. It's really odd to me that the people who are throwing these accusations at me are the same ones who think a Jewish man died for 3 days, literally rose, floated up into a cloud, was born of a virgin. So what I'm trying to say is, don't throw stones when you live in a glass house. Making these kind of degrading comments toward me when I'm actually talking to experts in the field that are pushing the boundaries of what the standard views are that typically most scholars hold to, and that is 7 letters are authentic, and she challenges that. So I don't see what's wrong with that. Well, there's another scholar that gets quite a few mentions in this book, actually, about Paul's letters. And I just so happen to be lucky enough to be joined by one of them today, and that is Dr. Marcus Vinzent. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to the channel again. And I do agree. I was surprised how often the name appears in Nina. And I said to Nina just a few days ago when we had a session together on the channel of Patristica, I said to her back in 2010 when she said to me this week, actually, only that already then, when she read the book that I was publishing on Marcion and the origin of the Synoptic Gospels, she said to me that she was convinced by that book. And I said to her, how can it? You were the only reader at that time who was convinced by that. When I published that book in 2014 and an earlier one in 2010, I remember when I was hired by King's College, I tell you, not for that book, which I published in 2010, not for what I would publish in 2014, but just and purely because I was moving into King's because they were attracted by the third-party funding and my good contacts I had into industry. So they were not interested in patristics, neither were they interested in New Testament, but they were interested in the money, as always universities are. Yeah. But the head of department at the time, who comes from a Baptist background, Paul Youngs, a fantastic musician, probably better known for his music than for what he wrote, although I think theology was fine. But he said to me, Marcus, you have to promise me one thing, that you're not going to teach or write on the New Testament. And I said to him, look, I'm bringing money. So how can you ask me not to teach and talk about the things which are of interest to me? And I can promise you what I've just published, that's also what I'm going to do further research on. And then he said to me, but can you tell me who believes in what you are doing? And I said, nobody. And then he was startled looking at me and he said, well, but if nobody believes you, I said, why should I repeat things people believe anyway? For me, it is challenging my views just as much as challenging everybody's views. I mean, we have to test everything. If what people believe, you believe, me, what I believe, if we are not testing what we believe, if you're just believing because, Derek, you have said, oh, I should believe you. But
Right.
if I'm not testing what you say, right, where am I? So I mean, what's the difference between a fundamentalist who just claims things like Trumps and the Trumps of the world? Yeah, what's the difference between an Islamic, Buddhist, whatever the nomenclature is, or Christian fundamentalist from somebody who trusts because he has checked and tested his beliefs?
If I may chime in, this is how I felt. I felt a little bit humbled when I started reading the book, right? Not that I knew she was right or I agree necessarily with the conclusions on some of the points. What happened when I read the book, I mentioned this in my interview with her. I had a commenter a while back talking about how they thought Paul may have been a fictional character. And I mocked that person in my comment section because I had just interviewed Steve Mason. Steve Mason did a fantastic job making it sound like you're talking. This is like half the phone conversation. We're getting the one side of the phone conversation, authentic letters of Paul. And so I had this like confidence about what I had learned from Steve, Dr. Mason, and went after this commenter and was like, dude, this is conspiracy. This is nuts. What are you talking about? Now, clearly, they may have been. Again, at the end of the day, who knows what really the reason for thinking Paul didn't exist was. But I just immediately disregarded it, laughed it off, like just said, I'm done. I'm not talking to this person and wasting my time. Then I read an actual PhD who's actually positing a very reasonable, test of questioning how we got to the place of thinking, what are these letters? We're willing to say half of them aren't real. Half of them are forged. We're willing to say that. So why do we say 7 are real? Well, they have similar language. I admit that I feel, when I still to this day will read Paul's letters and feel like there's a guy behind it, even today. But I'm willing to say that feeling is subjective. That is me bringing baggage to how I'm reading this material. And how do I know, right? So it humbled me to go, hold on, I'm just parroting and echoing what the scholars I've been interviewing say. Well, here's another scholar who's saying a different thing. And then your name gets brought up specifically in early patristic evidence and stuff that is external, but also within Pauline letters. So she's dropping your name quite often in different areas to push the dating of some of this early mentioning of Paul's or awareness of the letters of Paul, like 1 Clement. You know better than I would, but like clearly some of those early church fathers that are saying things that seem to know about the letters of Paul. But the first collection of the Pauline letters comes out of Marcion. And she asked a question that I think is a very important one. For me, I never thought about this. How did those letters get collected? Like, who went around and found those house churches, if we're going to like take the model that most people, and said, all right, hold on. Oh, this one's the one to Galatia. Oh, we found the one to Romans all the way in Rome. Oh, we went all the way to Philippi and found, like, who went around, collected them, then brought them to Marcion. And the first time we see all of them, including some of those forged versions, are in Marcion's collection. And that to me it didn't prove any conclusion. It created a complete like agnosticism in my mind of going, whoa, I don't know now. I don't really want to be overly certain and confident that what I'm reading is a 50s common era letter authentically written to a church in Philippi or in Corinth or in Rome. I don't know. And now I'm talking to you.
Yeah, no. We take that discussion further because I think the nice moves here is that Nina comes from New Testament studies, so she has worked for her life on the New Testament and particularly on Paul. And even after she had read my book in 2010 and then 2014, she was still convinced because she published still in 2016 a book on Galatians, where she talks about the real Paul, the historical Paul, and where she takes for granted that just the letter to the Galatians, as much as the others, are authentic letters of Paul. At least the 7 that most scholars until today take for granted that these are the authentic letters. And yet she comes from a different angle, because she moves from the New Testament towards the 2nd century and even towards the end of the 2nd century and in the further centuries afterwards. For me, it was the other way around. You know, I work on a retrospective mode, which means I start from the patristic stuff. That's where I'm at home. So from the medieval period throughout the 4th century, 3rd century, and then 2nd century and 1st century. So I move just from the complementary side. And that's why it was so interesting to see that even a scholar like herself, who for her life, I mean, she is now retired. So for her life scheme, in academia, she has taken for granted Paul as an authentic figure and has written about it. And I think it's fantastic if you, in reflection of your academic achievement, it is not conspiracy.
Right.
It's not an angel. And people have said, I'm obsessed by aliens, right? But I've never encountered an alien, maybe except for Paul and or others. Yeah. But anyway, so not obsessed by anything, but it's scholarly, meticulous work, a life's work, which has brought her to that point that now she sat down and wrote this fantastic book, I think. Yeah.
I love this book. And okay, so sorry if this is dialogue. I like to bounce back and forth.
No, I love it. Yeah.
I do not want to step on your toes because for those who don't know, Marcus allows me to call him Marcus. Dr. Vinzent, I might.
No, Marcus is much nicer. Anybody can be called Marcus. I mean.
Well, we really want to hear what you have learned. I am just Joe Blow learning and having fun and trying to draw out the best I can from my guest. And so I would like to get into your life a little, but I want to mention, like you just said, briefly, before we ask you to kind of explain what happened to you, almost like a testimonial. You're an academic. You've been doing this for decades. I mean, really for decades, and very hard. Nina, I saw an interview years ago, Authentic Paul. She's wrote on it, like you just said, Galatians, authentic, issues, biographic here in the opening of Galatians 1. Like, it's very real to her. Something happened to her over the past 6 to 7 years that has caused her to reflect, like you said, and really reconsider, are these letters at all authentic, any of them? And then she reassessed, saying she may have thought Acts, the portrayal of Paul, which is fictive in Acts. I'm not getting into, we're not disputing this. I think this is a common knowledge amongst critical scholars, because you only fundamentalists are going to argue that no, this literally bona fide happened, history, Acts is portraying exactly what happened. And this is a waste of conversation, in my opinion, with them on this matter. The issue arises where I think Michael Koshinosh's paper, Better Call Paul Saul, is a fundamental paper on showing why the scholarship that's tried to historicize Paul is maybe missing the point. Maybe there was a guy who had 2 names. Maybe. Unlikely, but to me it's unlikely, but maybe there was. I like the mimesis approach of saying his name was Saul, King Saul, who's trying to destroy King David, if you will, the seed of David, Christ. And here he is having a conversion moment to big King Saul to small Paul. And I think that literary fiction is beautifully done in Acts, and that she thinks he's such a monumental figure in this Acts historical fiction, or fiction of history, or however you want to call it, because I hear scholars dispute this term. I don't really know the difference. But that inspired a collection of letters in the name of the character from Acts. My biggest concern was, how do we explain the synoptic problem then? Because Mark, is the earliest, right, in our view. This is, I know you need to have your 2 cents, but that's why I want you to give your testimony leading up to where you're at, because she changed her mind. Acts is fiction, and then now it's helping to produce these letters. What happened to you? Did you go with the consensus? The 7 were authentic. The rest were forgeries. Mark came first. Probably Matthew after that, then Luke, then John, and like the standard critical scholarly position. What happened to you, Marcus, that made you start to become radical?
That radicalization was pure work. And as with Nina, I mean, Nina just said to us she had no revelation, right? It was pure, slow work. Since she had worked on Galatians, she noticed the enormous rhetoric behind it. And then she started making the parallels with the rhetorician. And in conversation with a colleague on classics, she then extended that type of research into the other letters. For me, it was similar and also a bit different, because when I studied theology, religious studies, history and archaeology, Jewish studies, I tried to avoid the New Testament because I thought much too little evidence, much too big hypotheses, people never confirming things, just making up new things. So there was no consensus.
Can you provide a few examples of what you mean for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, just take one example, right? The synoptic question is the best one, right?
Yeah.
In the book on Marcion, I provide a history of the synoptic question just to show that almost every angle and position had been held in the past. So there's no harmony there. In the meantime, we agree. I mean, this was the book on Marcion, the gray one. Yeah, the
gray one.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, here. That's the one. Oh, the Italian's preface was the second one. No, it wasn't another one, but in the same series.
Is it
Marcion
and the dating?
Yeah, Marcion and the dating of synoptic gospels. Yeah, that's the one. So in here, I give a short summary on the positions that were held on the synoptic question. And I tell you, there's every possibility that people have seriously argued for. So be it Luke first, John first, Matthew first, Mark first. Then we have people who claim Q is the basis, together with Mark, for the rest of the of Matthew and Luke, and even for John. But then we have people who have turned it upside down, the whole thing, said, well, Thomas's gospel is earliest, and others relied on. Then because they couldn't make up their minds, people settled. The majority today settles on the so-called two sources hypothesis, which means Q, of which we have not a single manuscript, even not a single testimony for it. It's pure make-up of scholarship. Still, the majority of scholars hold to it. Okay, serious scholars, friends of mine, dedicated to Q. And then together with Q is a German name, Quelle, because it's a German scholar who has invented it in the 19th century, 19th century, and Mark as a second source. And those, they date into the 60s of the first century. So that's one position. But that position only works because Q is condensed out of the parallels between Matthew and Luke.
Right.
People have always recognized Matthew and Luke have so much in common, I mean, literally in common, that they thought there must be a source underneath it. That's Q, the Quelle. The problem with that reasoning is you have to have two sources, Matthew and Luke, from which you deduct Q, which are independent. Because if you and me collate and people say, oh, well, they're saying the same thing, then if we know each other, well, you could have from me, I could have from you, not from a third source, So the condition for Q, for the reconstruction, was that Matthew and Luke are independent and didn't know of each other. Now, the problem is a lot of material they have in common, which people cannot locate in Q and cannot locate in Mark. And still they have things in common. So these we call minor agreements. Somebody has said, oh, these are just minor agreements. But these minor agreements, as now everybody agrees, are major agreements. There are so much agreements that people can no longer hold the position that Matthew didn't know Luke and Luke didn't know Matthew. So what to do? You refine your theory. On a theory comes a hypertheory and a hypertheory. And Bowen gives us a scheme to account for these overlaps between Matthew and Luke that you cannot get your head around, right? So anyway, what I'm just saying, there is a lot of doubt on the two sources hypothesis. Now, the other hypothesis was developed by a very good friend of mine and who has a very good scholarly student. Mark Goodegger is the student, yeah?
Right.
And Mark Goodegger really is and is still a voice against the two sources hypothesis. Now, you can see there is no consensus. And for me, when I started working on this book on Marcion, I believed still in the two sources hypothesis. I had one big problem, because I only came to Marcion having worked on your nice example of Christ's resurrection. And as a scholar in patristics, I was asked to give a paper in Rome on Christ's resurrection narratives in the 2nd and 1st century. And I thought, oh, well, I know of so many stories about fathers talking about Christ's resurrection in patristics in the 4th century. It shouldn't be a problem to write a paper about the 1st and the 2nd century. Particularly when you look into every library you can go, there are thousands of, let's say, even monographs, certainly hundreds, but probably thousands of monographs on Christ's resurrection in the New Testament. In 2010, when I wrote this book, Christ's Resurrection in Early Christianity, there was not one single book on Christ's resurrection in the Fathers. And I thought, somebody is here not from this world. How can it be that hundreds and thousands of scholars write on Christ's resurrection as the core of Christianity in the New Testament, while the church fathers didn't have any monograph written about them on that subject? Only two possible answers I could at the time give to myself. It was uncontroversial, but B, if it was uncontroversial, then we would find evidence in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. I looked into the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, and I read every single piece of work that exists, just looking for evidence, what the fathers have to say about Christ's resurrection, and to find the question why people don't write about it.
Oh, hold on. I'm so sorry. This is important because Dr. Richard Miller, I've had on quite often, talking about resurrection and reception in early Christianity. And I don't want to get lost in the sauce of everything that he argues, of course, because there's so much that we can go into. But one of the things he did observe, and he was trying to tell me this early on, and it's so difficult for us with the baggage that we have, the apologetics that we have, the post-Enlightenment historicizing everything that we have. He said there's something ironically missing from the early church fathers, and that is a bona fide work by Christians historicizing the events of the resurrection as if this is bona fide, it had to have happened, it's so obvious, and they're making a strong historical case to try and prove it. And he was like, why is that lacking? And the first time we get any bona fide historian, Eusebius, coming on, he echoes this sentiment of like, brothers, I'm going to do my best. There's only crumbs in the dark about the earlier times of our church. Like he seems like he's trying to piece things together, but no one has written something on this level until he comes along. And I guess the question I have to you is, someone has said they're looking for the resurrection. Like when you say they're not writing about the resurrection, what do you mean? Like they're not writing as in like making a case to try and defend the historicity of the event, or what do you mean by that? Marcus?
Well, I mean by that that the resurrection of Christ simply does not occur in these writings in the 1st and 2nd centuries.
Interesting.
That's one of the reasons, yeah. And when you look into, we have a great German scholar from Frankfurt, a Jesuit, famous for development of Christian belief. And he wrote several volumes, these sizes, right? Alois Grillmeier. Christ is also translated into English, Christ in Christian Tradition. And when you check in the indices of these volumes, which give us the belief in everything related to Christ that the fathers have developed, the notion of Christ's resurrection appears just twice. Twice about 2 heretics in the 4th century. So he has
nothing before that?
He has no discussion about it. So I was wondering, and I thought something must be wrong here. And after having studied the entire literature of these 3 centuries, it occurred to me that there is a dichotomy in our literature. So Christ's resurrection does appear. However, whenever, and now comes the strict link, and nobody has disputed this strict link so far. There's a strict linkage between Paul as being known by some works or authors, and once Paul is being mentioned and his letters, which brings us back to our topic, then that specific author or work will mention the resurrection of Christ. In every writing of the first 2 centuries, where Paul is not mentioned or even not hinted at, not known, you will not find one word about Christ's resurrection.
May I chime in to this?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, please don't forget where you're going. Actually,
no, I don't.
If you feel like you might, I'd rather you continue. If you feel like you might forget.
No. Look, I love students interrupting me. So please.
Okay, well, I don't want to interrupt you. I just think this is important that the viewers walking with us here, because exactly. This is radical. Like, this is really interesting. I like radical. I wrote an article a while back.
I interrupt you. It's not radical. It's not radical in the sense of interpretation, because this is fact. This is something everybody, you and me, your wife, your kids, everybody who has eyes and if I need glasses, can simply do the check of the facts.
That's what makes it radical to me, because what's so radical is it's right there under our nose. It's right here, but we have baggage. So we don't even see it. We are literally being told a certain narrative, and we can't. I give
you stunning examples. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
We have a work which we can't date precisely. Some New Testament scholars date it to the 1st century. You know, I'm a bit skeptical about these early datings.
Yeah.
Whenever we date them, we are all agreeing that this is a work which comes from the 1st or 2nd century. It's the so-called Pastor Hermas. This is a huge book for early Christian times, an enormous book of 60 chapters, a big book, a big manuscript. It gives us an insight into Christian history or Christian community in Rome, as it claims, yeah? And it mentions bishops, it mentions Christ, not by name, but the Son who comes down, and it gives us all kinds of titles for this Savior. He is the door. He is our solution. He is our helper. He is God knows what. There's one thing which he is not. He's not the risen Christ. No mention of Christ's resurrection whatsoever. And despite the fact that this writing locates itself in Rome, where you would have thought with Paul in Rome and Romans letters and so the Romans, no, there's no hint at any relation with Pauline letters or with Paul himself, and hence no mention of Christ's resurrection. I'll give you a second example. Our earliest catechism everybody agrees is the Didache.
Right.
Now, again, we can dispute whether the text that we have, which comes from manuscripts of later times, has been developed or whatever it is. But people usually, New Testament scholars, again, dated to the 1st century. I would be a bit more skeptical. But this is a text which has a moral impetus in the beginning. Then comes a description of Christian sacraments. So it's about baptism, is about the Eucharist. The Lord's Prayer is in there. People should go to churches on Sundays, about teachers, apostles, prophets. The only thing which is missing is any mention of Paul, any relation to Paul. There's no quote, even not a ditch of vocabulary. And now you give me the answer whether you find the resurrection of Christ in this first Christian catechism.
No.
What's your answer?
Clearly not.
And see,
it's very.
That's what I call the close link. Either or. If you have Paul, you have the resurrection of Christ. If you don't have Paul, even not in the catechism, where we believe if baptism is linked to Christ's resurrection, as we have it in Romans 6, you would think that a catechism that introduces you into the new belief of Christ cannot miss Christ's resurrection.
Right.
Yet it does.
Okay, this brings me to this, what I was going to say about I wrote an article years ago calling it the minimal doubts argument. And in it, I'm pretty much just spinning a reverse of like why we should doubt, why the New Testament itself gives us reason to doubt. And just reading the narratives, I'm mainly targeting an audience of fundamentalists, but there's some deeper stuff I get into.
Yeah.
And in it, you see the tradition of doubt, right? You get people like Matthew 28, where they're on the mountain, they're there in the presence of the resurrected Jesus, but some doubted. How are you going to doubt? He's right there, right? Like, what the heck? How do you do that? Well, then the doubting tradition with Thomas, and we find in Luke there's doubting, of course, as well. The guy on the road to Emmaus, which is mythical. Thomas is mythical. There's so many. It's clearly fictional, but that tradition made me wonder, is this hinting at something in the early church that, maybe historical, that many of the people early on doubted this notion of resurrection, that he is alive again after death. And then I get to Acts chapter 10, and I'm reading about Paul. Really, they give the role to Peter, that he's going to the Gentile. Really, this seems to be trying to tell Peter in some way, like, hey, get with the program of whatever the Christian movement is here now. And what is the mission? The mission to the Gentiles. It's to Cornelius. And this is a pivotal moment in the book of Acts, because in this moment, there is mimesis between Acts 10 and 11 and Jonah. And when you read Jonah, he's running from God, and there's no doubt that God is showing mercy to the enemies, to the people who are not supposed to receive the Holy Spirit. And they receive the Holy Spirit. And even the Jews afterwards are like, there's no way. And he has to explain it and prove to them, like, no, dude, I know. But listen, these non-Jews are getting it. So I saw a correlation between, just as the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth, or the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall, like Jonah was in the belly of the well, right? Resurrection in my mind tied to the mission of the Gentiles. So I found there was some correlation in my mind. My pattern seeking recognition skills told me, when you have Gentile mission, when you have this larger, broader commission to go with Paul's mission, you have resurrection. And I kept seeing them connected.
You saw the right thing. And I think you absolutely were right, because it is that link between Paul. We can ask ourselves whether it's to do with Paul more than with the mission to the pagans or the Gentiles, right. Or whether it's the Gentiles believing in some afterlife, and after death life, more than the Jews. Because as we know, and I did research on tombstones, for example, the majority of tombstones in the times of Jesus do not portray a belief in any afterlife after death. The reason for that is that the Torah, so the old Jewish belief, and the writings of the ancient Jews do not know of any afterlife. Because the Torah says quite simply, if you die, if I die, we can survive, however, only through our male offsprings.
Right.
That's the point. If you are left as a widower and you haven't had your male offspring, then you've got a problem. If a woman is a widow, and hasn't got the offspring, even my brother, when I'm the deceased, even my brother has to engage with her and create a male offspring, because without offspring, no future life, which means we only live through our kids. Mm-hmm. That was the teaching, and that's being held by the majority of Jews at the time of Jesus. Now, if Christians were recruited from those Jews, how could a Jew who doesn't believe, because he believes in the Torah, how can a Jew who believes in the Torah and not in the later writings like the prophets Ezekiel and others, but if he believes in the Torah, how can he subscribe to any form of afterlife after death, except through kids? So the majority of the people who might have joined the early Christian movement were people who were disinterested into any form of resurrection, let alone of the Messiah. They were believing in, and as Jews, in a belief system where resurrection does not figure at all. And that explains those early Christian writings like the ones I just mentioned, the Didache or the Pastor Hermos and others. If you read the New Testament backwards, from Revelation through the letters of John, through the Catholic letters, have you come across any mention of Christ's resurrection?
No, I do. There is propitiation.
Only in 2 Peter, and this is the only letter which mentions Paul by name, and the letters of Paul.
What about the propitiation for our sins, but not only ours, but for the whole world? That's still not resurrection, right? You're just saying that's atonement. Okay.
In Revelation, you might have a kind of ascension to heaven.
Right. That's commonplace. Josephus accounts that Moses had an ascension to heaven.
Yeah, exactly. But there's no indication of resurrection of Christ. But the first letter that knows of Paul, 2 Peter, there you will find Christ's resurrection. So the link is always the same. Yeah.
What do you think, audience? What do you think about this? Tell me this isn't wild. Paula Gia, you got to interview my boy here. You got to interview Marcus. This is wild. I love it. Okay.
So then we have the question. Then, of course, I ventured that for the first time when I was in Cambridge. And one of my colleagues, Wolfram Kinzig, he asked me 3 crucial questions. He said, Marcus, I can't believe you unless you have given me answers to 3 questions. First, what about Christian creed? What we believe. Second is, what do you make of the Sunday? And third, what do you make of Easter celebration? So my answer to him was, you're a specialist in liturgy and in belief systems, and you have written most about creeds. You give your answer for the first question yourself. And in 1999, we published a book together, also with Christoph Markschies, on exactly that question. And he wrote a history of the development of the early Christian creeds. It's a book which has appeared with de Gruyter on the Tauffragen and the Apostles' Creed. You will find it certainly when you are checking it out.
Yeah, I was just showing people your stuff.
Yeah, Wolfram Kinzig and my name, and you will find it. And in this book, an enormous history of the development of the creeds. And he discovered that the so-called Roman Creed, the Apostles' Creed, or Apostolic Creed, as we call it, we have a short beginning. Do you believe, and these are also the baptismal questions, do you believe in God the Father Almighty? Yes. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Yes. Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? Yes. But then we notice that in many denominations, even today, for baptism, the second article on Christ is enlarged. So you do believe in Christ, he is, and then comes Pontius Pilate and everything with crucifixion, and who has risen on the third day. By checking the manuscripts and also all the reference in the Fathers, he discovered we have two traditions of this creed in history. One is the one we know and which we have in the Catholic tradition for baptism, which we don't have for the Protestant church, I have to say, because the Protestant church has an intermingling of the two traditions, but we'll come to that. So we have two traditions. One is the one we know is the Apostles' Creed, integrated into baptism. Mm-hmm. But the second one has, for the part of Christ, only the question, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And I give you now the Latin text, or the Greek text, and that Latin reads natum et passum. Or in Greek, it's the same. The question is only whether he was born and suffered. No word of the resurrection. And what from Kinsey shows in this long history, that the oldest creed of the Christians, which was held at least for the first 200 years, probably even longer, was this short creed where people only believed that Christ was born and had suffered.
Not the suffering was the key, right?
Suffering was the key. Absolutely. And he then discovered that when Luther, who stuck to this formula, went to the printer and asked the printer to print his new Protestant or Lutheran agenda for baptism, the printer could not believe that Martin Luther wanted us to say no more about Christ than that he was born and suffered. And you know what he put into his book? Etc. And since then, the Protestant church, without Luther knowing, the Protestant church has introduced into the Protestant agenda, and you will see it when you go to Protestant church for baptism. People are being asked now for their sons and daughters, do you believe as a Godfather in Christ who was born and suffered, etc.? That's all. Christ's resurrection was missing and still is missing there. So he gave the answer himself for the first question. People did not have in the creed the resurrection of Christ. That enters the creed in the 4th century and not before. But he also gave through this the answer to the second question about Easter. Because in the Easter Paschal controversy, which is around the times of Irenaeus, end of 2nd century, the bishops around the Mediterranean have one agreement on what they do celebrate and what they fight over. It was just the dating of Easter, but not the content. They all agree that Pascha, Easter, the word in Greek, Easter, Pascha, comes from Paschein, which means suffering. So unlike us in the West and wherever around the world, that Easter is the celebration of Christ's resurrection, in the first 200 and longer years, Easter was the celebration of the cross and Christ's suffering, not of his resurrection.
Okay. You've done this. You've gone on a deep dive here. So I don't know why I want to naturally look beyond just Jewish circles to try and answer these questions, but that's because I know that the guild of scholarship will only look for Jewish answers to Jewish things. And they'll just say that Christianity is purely coming out of Jewish prior antecedent. I'm thinking to myself, recently I did a video. I don't know if it's public yet. No, it's not. It's being edited, where I kind of showed parallels between Addis and Jesus. And the very same week we celebrate the suffering and death and, of course, resurrection now of Jesus, we have of Addis, who suffers a horrendous death, and that they celebrate, they flagellate themselves, they moan and cry for 3 days. This was instituted by Claudius in the 50s of the first century. Yeah. That it was a Roman sanctioned high religious festival, the very same time of the year that we're celebrating Jesus' suffering. And I'm wondering if you think, because the typical answer that people will have is that Pharisees had a concept of resurrection, but they didn't have a concept of an individual resurrection. They had a concept of the resurrection of the dead. So do you think there's pagan antecedents behind the Pauline motif? And is it coincidence that the agenda is to go to the Gentiles, that they're just now having all of this kind of commonplace Gentile beliefs about individual deities or demigods that resurrect, or, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. I tell you,
what are your thoughts about resurrection?
I tell you, the overlap between the so-called pagan belief, and the Pauline belief starts earlier. It starts with Alexander the Great. Jewish belief in the Torah, as I mentioned it, without believing in a resurrection of Christ, without resurrection at all of human beings, that becomes superseded in the 5th century, but even more, and particularly that's why I mentioned him, with Alexander the Great.
Right.
With the influence of Platonic thinking, and most particularly of Zoroastrian thinking, which was behind in the Persian Empire. So these beliefs, where people started in the Greek realm believing in a life after death, in a life of the soul, in a life, even in a physical resurrection.
Yeah.
That becomes integrated into the Jewish beliefs. It was never a Jewish item. It was an import, which was a novel import. It was the innovators amongst the Jews. And that's why when Josephus, for example, talks about that he went through the different schools, he says, well, I was also a Sadducee, right? Not believing in resurrection. And then only when I ended up at the end to become a Pharisee, and then he shows us and says, well, the difference is that these Pharisees believe in a resurrection of human beings. He knows this is an innovative form of Jewish tradition, or we shouldn't even call it tradition. It's an innovation in the Jewish realm.
Right.
And that's why the majority, as on the tombstones, which I mentioned, the majority was not Pharisaic. The majority of Jews did not believe in this novel nonsense which came from the East and the Greeks and the Zoroastrians. Hence, my guess is, but that is hypothesis, but my guess is that also in the beginning, the majority of Christians were just like people of the Didache or the Pastor Hermas and didn't believe. And because we know that Paul's affiliation, whether he was a Pharisee or whether he wasn't, is another matter. He himself, at least the letters claim that he was a Pharisee. Even in the 10-letter collection, it's said that he was a Pharisee, which only means that this particular belief in a resurrection is embedded into these letters. So we shouldn't be surprised that when it comes to dealing with the cross, with this stumbling block for everybody. I mean, you're right. That suffering has been highlighted and people indulge in suffering. I mean, we always had sadomasochists and masochists in life. They existed all the time, and people could indulge into it. And me living in Spain, I mean, I can tell you what happens on Good Friday here. People love to have these processions, and celebrating the devil and blood and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, I think for a majority society, that was not appealing. And hence it was a stumbling block. And why were the Pharisees quite innovative and also convincing? Because they integrated Greek, Roman, and Zarathustrian beliefs in a Judaism of their day. And they were writing as Jews, they were writing in Greek, and they were thinking in Greek. And our New Testament is written in Greek, and Paul's letters are in Greek. Yeah. So we have a Greek form of belief that is going to start with those writings. Hence, it should not be a surprise to us that in those days and those times with these backgrounds, the idea of a resurrection of people come up, and with it, also that the protagonist, the hero, is the hero for the new belief system, which is a resurrection belief. And I think that's why Jesus cannot end on a cross, but has to become a risen Christ.
Okay. So I want to keep painting this narrative as we go through the entire New Testament as a big picture. I'll tell you, I was talking to Nina and we were trying to tackle Paul's letters, and I had one big question. She said, this is a huge question. I don't know the answer to this right now. Maybe someone, will come along and answer and solve it. Maybe you have a solution. As we tackle this whole idea of resurrection, Paul's letters, synoptic problem, which is completely, up in the air about how to solve it. What is the case? I've been pretty persuaded by some scholars I've read who see correlation between the letters of Paul we have in our New Testament today and Mark. Mark's gospel seems to have some overlap that makes me think that theologically they're on the same page and maybe even knows of Paul's letters, right? And I'm like, if Mark's earlier than Acts, because Acts is written, later, we have this idea that Mark comes first, then Matthew or Luke, then John, and of course Luke has this compendium with Acts, that they're dependent on Mark. How is it when Mark knows Paul's letters, that chronology, I'm trying to paint a unified chronology. She says Acts came first, then all the letters of Paul, but Mark's before Acts. So how do we explain if she's saying that the character in Acts inspired the fictional letters of Paul? You know her position better than I do. And Acts is where Paul starts here, but Mark already has a lot in common with these letters that scholars are pointing out looks like Mark knows it before Acts. How do you solve what you see Nina's work is showing? The idea of resurrection, how you would chronologically try to solve this problem. Now, I know there's no way to prove. It's a mess at this point. Like, to know exactly, it'd be definitive, but how would you solve this whole issue?
Yeah, I think there is an easy solution to that. Not easy in the sense that it's not a complex answer too, but there is I think there is a solution to your question and to your problem. Let me start not with Mark, let me start with Acts. I think Nina is right that Acts is the foundation for the Paul as we know him in the canonical tradition. So we have 14 letters today in our canonical New Testament. And for these letters, I do think she is absolutely right that Acts is the foundation. Mm. But that is one layer. It is the layer where the intersection is between Paul and the canonical New Testament. And I would even say that this connection is done by what I call, and also some other colleagues call, the canonical redactors. And who they are, you only need to read Irenaeus with his work against the heresies. Everything which we call typically canonical, be it the belief in 14 letters of Paul, be it in the presence of revelation, be it that there is not one gospel, there is no Thomas, no Barnabas, no whatever. No, it's exactly the 4 canonical gospels. That's what you get in Irenaeus. And which are the most important letters for Irenaeus of Paul? It's the Deutero-Paulines and the Pseudo-Paulines. So exactly what we would be doubting, he starts with quoting from those letters. So this is the layer earlier than Irenaeus, or at the same time the contemporary Dionysius of Corinth. That's the other person, and potentially Polycarp. We don't know, but those people of that school, of that tradition, at that time. So we are in the late 160s, in the 170s. These are the first people ever who know of Acts. Nobody has any idea about Acts before these times. So now if we say that Acts is the precondition for this Paul that appears in the New Testament, in the canonical New Testament, that is where I see the link. Now I have checked, and I'm not the first one. Barnett in the 1940s did it already, and he checked every 2nd century text that we know, even if we can't date these texts precisely. But these are texts, at least, which already are referred to, for example, by Irenaeus and others. So these are prior to Irenaeus, like First Clement, Polycarp, Ignatius, and a few other writings. If we check all these writings for Pauline traces, indeed, we find Pauline traces, even if Paul is not mentioned explicitly. But we find that people somehow have some knowledge of Paul's letters. And it is interesting, they have Paul's letters not in their entirety as we have them in the canonical New Testament, apparently. Because nobody of these people I just mentioned, I mean, all the writings before Irenaeus, none of them know of any pseudo-Pauline letter. So they have no indications that Hebrews exists. We have no indication that the pastoral letters exist, which means the 2 letters to Timothy and the 1 letter to Titus. So we can exclude, interestingly, as if these scholars, I mean, if these letters had been around, then we would say that all these 2nd century theologians were as clever as 20th century and 21st century scholarship of the New Testament, that they were able to exclude these 4 letters as pseudo letters, as forgeries. That's why they don't make use of them. Or what is historically, I think, more likely than claiming that all these people were clever New Testament scholars, that these letters didn't exist at the time. And the same we have to say for Acts. Because otherwise they would have quoted Acts, or at least referred to it somehow, which they don't. So
this is in the 160s to 170s.
Yeah.
Okay.
So before 160, none of these 4 letters are known. And Acts is not known. Which brings me to the fact that these texts belong to what I call the canonical redaction. So to the times of Irenaeus. Now, within the 7 letters and the 3 letters, so the Deutero and the claimed authentic letters, there are also passages which are never hinted at, quoted, which people don't know. And I give you one example, Romans 15 and 16, the last 2 chapters. People never make use of them. And now comes the interesting fact that what you find in Romans 15 and 16 is closely linked to exactly those texts which we've just said are from Irenaeus' time. I give you one example. You know the couple Prisca and Aquila.
Yeah.
who had to leave.
Priscilla and Aquila, for those who...
Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila.
Yeah.
The people who claimed to have been driven out of Rome by Claudius, the emperor, in the years 40 or 42 or whatever. Yep. They only appear exactly in those 2 chapters of Rome, which are unknown before Irenaeus. And they appear exactly in those writings which we've just mentioned from the times of Irenaeus, in Acts. Again, you can see 2 chapters are missing, and then we have the information from people like Origen that the 2 chapters of Romans are missing in the 10-letter collection of Marcion. Hence, I would say these are the same chapters which are only being added to Romans in the times of Irenaeus. So we have a close link between the material that are absent from Marcion's 10-letter collection and the material that was added by Irenaeus in Irenaeus' time. And I've made that kind of comparison in a very nuanced way. I give you another great example. For Acts, Paul is the organizer and the missionary person. So he has 3 journeys for his missionary work. And in that missionary work, one central act is the collection of money for Jerusalem. In the second letter to the Corinthians, this collection of money occupies 2 full chapters, 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians 9. Now you give me the answer. Do you think any author or any work prior to Irenaeus makes ever use of these 2 chapters or ever any hint to these 2 chapters?
I'm going to guess not.
You're a genius.
Yay!
So you've got the story, yeah? So the entire collection is mentioned again in which chapters of Romans? Next answer.
So repeat the question.
So in which chapter of Romans? Romans has 16 chapters.
Right.
In which of these chapters you will find a mention of the collection for Jerusalem?
15, 16.
Bingo.
Okay, so
you understood the problem.
I get what you're doing here and what you're explaining and how there's clearly an addition, padding out Paul. It's almost like scholars describe it almost like when they're trying to explain the movements of John the Baptist and Jesus, granting their hypothesis, that they're 2 different movements. So how do we merge them in a way to make them work? And so here they are canonizing Paul to tame him from the school of Marcion and its powerful influence in the Christian world. So how do we get these guys on our side? We tell them, among men ever born, John the Baptist was the greatest man of all men. Come over here, John the Baptist followers. I mean, just in his analogy,
exactly.
You're saying Irenaeus or these redactors are working overtime to complement the existing forms and popular texts of the Christian movement, but they're also padding out details that they think is relevant for their particular version. And then they're propagandistically, I don't know, I would imagine you side with...
It is propagandistic.
Yeah, so do you think this is where I bet it's messy? Because you either have, Marcion had the authentic letters of Paul, and then, and also, by the way, Marcion had a gospel, and then Irenaeus, or, these redactors, right? They claim Marcion redacted their Luke, or it's the other way around. Well, How do you solve this mess that we're in?
And that mess you can only see by looking at every literature that we have in the 2nd century. And these people, like First Clement, like Polycarp, like Justin, they show us that these additional chapters, like Romans 15, 16, 2 Corinthians 8, 9, and I could mention a few more, right, are only being added at a later time, because otherwise they would feature like the other texts, and they don't. So it's not juggling around because we just want to reverse the order. No, I think it's quite clear that this collection, which has Acts and has the 10 letters of Paul plus the 4 pseudo-Pauline, that this is a conglomerate that has been fabricated towards the end of the 2nd century in the times of Irenaeus. Now, that's why I think Nina is right. When you look into these 14 letters, the foundation for these 14 letters of Paul is Acts. Because every feature that we have in Acts is somehow implemented into these letters.
They're adding to even the 10 that Marcion had and additional invented letters on top of to make 14. You're saying even in the ones that Marcion already had, they're adding things to, like Romans. Okay.
And I'll give you one example again. We have, amongst those pseudo-letters, the forged letters, the pastorals, we have 1 to Titus and 2 to Timothy. Now, what are the redactors doing? They use one of the 2 names which existed already in the 10-letter collection of Marcion, Titus. The Marcionite collection has only 6 names that it knows of, and Titus is one of them. So one of the forged letters is addressed to one of the people know from Marcion's collection, Titus. But they address 2, so the double of the number, to somebody unknown in the 10-letter collection of Marcion, and that's Timothy. Now, Timothy never appears in any of the 10 letters of Paul in the Marcionite collection. What are the redactors doing? Just as with Priscilla and Aquila, which is sprinkled into Romans 15:16, they take Timothy and sprinkle it like over the cake of the 10 letters. And here suddenly he becomes a co-editor, a co-author of these letters, and he starts greeting the people together with Paul. And Paul in these letters, in the redacted form, suddenly has an introduction to Timothy, for example, in the first letter to Corinth, 4th chapter. And he says, oh, Timothy is a fantastic co-worker of mine. You need to trust him. Why do you need to trust him? Because people didn't know of him.
Right.
So the redactors introduced Timothy as co-author, as a co-worker of Paul, in order to fix the new forged letters to the 14-letter collection. It's like hyperlinks, you need to stitch it together so that people, like most people today, think, oh well, these forged letters have always been part of Paul.
That's the whole agenda. Yeah,
that's the agenda.
Yeah. So okay, you bring up something important. My common sense radar tells me you wouldn't name drop someone unless they're important in your community. And I know that this is not to disparage the position that Paul didn't exist, but I'm going to give you one of the reasons I'm a little hesitant on jumping the gun of assuming that Paul is completely made up as a literary figure. Now, maybe they made up Paul in Acts and he's the foundation, but if Acts is the foundation to canonical Paul, let's call the redactors canonical Paul, and let's call original Paul Marcion school, which doesn't have Acts, the 10 letters that Marcion has. For me, I think that it makes more sense in my mind to use an authority figure that was significant in a community somehow, probably had some original significance in a movement. You name drop that authority because he has power behind him. I understand the reasoning. She's got some really interesting thought about epistolary fictions and how Paul becomes this kind of powerful figure through the myth of Acts. And then therefore you want to name drop this figure that they invented in the story. But in my mind, I'm thinking there was probably a guy, and you name drop that guy if you want people to take it serious. Like if he was whole cloth invented, it's easier for me to wrap my head around. But
let me not jump too quickly to your track.
Okay.
Not because I don't believe what you're saying. I'm probably even inclined to follow you.
Right.
But I would have one more stage in between.
I'm all ears.
And that's to do with the fact that we have said the canonical collection is clear. This is based on Acts. This is the canonical Paul. So it's a fictional Paul.
Got it.
The fact that in the Marcionite collection, we also are dealing with a collection. Whether it was Marcion who was the redactor or somebody else. Park that for a moment, yeah?
Yep.
But if we have these 10 letters as a collection, then we have them as a ready-made. It's like you have the food ready to just put into the microwave.
Gotcha.
It is prefabricated, as all collections are. Nothing is being collected which hasn't a collector. And even if the collector only gives the order of letters, that introduces some kind of content and hierarchy. So what we've got is the ready-made 10 collection in the Marcionite collection. And that's why this is and cannot be in original form. Unlike or unless it were Paul himself who had put together that precise collection. And this, I think, I doubt. And I doubt for very, very good reasons. And here, for the first time, I'm in consensus with most of my New Testament colleagues, right, who make the distinction between Deuteropauline letters, namely the 3, 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians, and the 7 letters. And I can support their view of the distinction between these two items. Why? Because we have clear content oppositions. But even more, we have language, grammar, style, all sorts of differences. That's why colleagues usually make the distinction between the Deuteropaulines and the Paulines. So my view is that the collector of the Marcionite 10-letter collection has already made use of 2 sorts of letters. And interestingly, I think these 2 sorts of letters were already themselves collections. Why do I think that? Not because I'm just putting out of my head, but if you look into the order that the witnesses give us for the order of Marcion's collection, the 3 letters, precisely the 3 Deuteropaulines, are stuck in one block. When you look into the canonical order of letters in the manuscripts, the 3 letters are not and no longer in one block. Between these letters, we each have 1 letter of the 7 letters interspersed. And that's also one of the side arguments, right? Why I think the Marcionite collection is earlier than the 14-letter collection of the canonical redaction. Why? Try it with your sons. We are unable, if we have a collection of 14 letters, how on earth would we be able to draw out those 3 letters and put them together in one block in our collection? It's like the other discussion we had before. We would assume that you and me are New Testament scholars of the 20th and 21st century who know from language and content that these 3, which are not stuck together in the canonical collection, belong together and belonged together, and that we, because of the reasoning, put them together. Historically impossible. So the way has to be the other way around. The 10-letter collection where these 3 are stuck together show that this is a collection which was integrated into this 10-letter collection as a collection. And there is a second argument which has shown me that this is the better explanation. Even the 7 letters that are left Where?
Marcion specifically.
In Marcion's text. The 7 letters in Marcion's text, he picked as a collection. How do I know that? When we look into the letter to the Galatians in Marcion's collection, we have one interesting verse which is well attested. It's 5:21. And here the Paul of Marcion says, the flesh will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. But he also says in the same verse, as I have said before. Now you can read the first 5 chapters of Galatians. You will not find that Paul has said that before. But when you look into 1 Corinthians 15:50, he repeats the same sentence. Flesh will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, which means Galatians, as I've said before, is the opening letter of Marcion's collection. It's the first letter, as our witnesses tell us. Now, if he makes a back reference and says, well, as I've said before, but 1 Corinthians comes after Galatians, he has made a mistake. The same mistake Luke makes in his gospel, where he says, Jesus talks in Nazareth and says, well, you should believe because you know about the miracles that I did in Capernaum. But Capernaum comes a chapter after.
Gotcha. Now, one might assume, right, the devil's advocate here, one might assume, well, he had other letters at some point and he wrote a letter before that he might have said it, or maybe he visited them and told them this before, as I've said before. Assuming there's assumptions here.
Occam's razor. Occam's razor. You have to go as a historian, not with fiction, but with the easier explanation. Everything could happen which we don't know.
Yeah.
And in addition to your 2 possible arguments that it could have happened, there could be a million others.
True.
Yeah?
Yep.
But if we have a simple explanation that we have the same verse.
Right.
And only in one verse he says, as I've said before. And if in addition we have a collection, namely the canonical, where Galatians is after 1 Corinthians, where the back reference is correct, then this collected order seems to have the base, or seems to be on the basis of that one. And that was the reason why Matthias Klinghardt, for the first time, discovered that Marcion's gospel is earlier than Luke. Because if we did not have Marcion's gospel, where Tertullian tells us that this gospel starts with Jesus being in Capernaum and then moves to Nazareth, we wouldn't have the reason, as in this case, to say, well, then the Occam's razor, the easiest explanation is that Luke is later and made a mistake by reordering it, because we have one gospel where the order functions and where the back reference is correct. Yeah? So,
okay.
Which means, in short, Marcion makes already use of 2 collections, a 3-letter collection of Deuteropaulines and 7 letters which existed in the canonical order, however, not in the canonical text. It was the text which was likely more the text that he makes use of, but in a different order. And this is the reason why I think, the 10-letter collection doesn't give us the original Paul, it's a redacted collection.
So it's already in Marcion, it's already
like in the canonical redaction, we have a Marcionite redaction. And we are not surprised then that the Paul speaks the language of Marcion.
Right.
He is an ascetic where even if people are married, they shouldn't have intercourse, which later is being changed in the canonical redaction, where women have authority to prophesy and should not subjugate to husbands, and a number of other things. Yeah, we can. If
I
we
wanted
have
to get into those weeds. Can I do a super chat and use the
Yeah, of
restroom
course,
real
yeah.
quick? Because I've got some really, I think we can go deeper into the theology of the letters too, because that was something I wanted to do with Nina.
Yeah, no.
I'm going to start with the question.
Let me just,
super chat.
yeah, that's fine. I just want to wrap up because that was the answer to your livesay question. Yeah. So Acts can be prior to canonical Paul, but the authentic Paul is not in Marcion. And let's discuss.
Got it. Okay. I'll be back here in just a second. Do the Melkites maintain that their apostolic succession does not include Paul, instead tracing directly to Peter because Paul was always seen problematic to the east? I will be right back. Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I should give you another $10. I mean, you're absolutely right. Because that's the point. That's the entire point. It's not just the Melkites, right? Everybody in the 2nd and even the 3rd century, and sometimes even later, like the Melkites, were skeptical of Paul because there was this proximity between Paul and the Marcionite collection, which brings me back to Derek's earlier question about Mark. Now, Mark, why do you call a gospel, which, like all or most scholars today agree, both Mark and Luke, just like Matthew and John, are names which are pseudonymously given to these gospels? But which kind of an idiot, I say, would choose not an apostle if you want to give an authority to a gospel? So if these names are not the original names of the authors, if they are given by other people to render the gospels a certain credibility, why would you go for Mark and Luke? Matthew and John is easy because Matthew is part of the 12 apostles who are being called by Jesus, just as John is. Mark isn't, Luke is not either. Which brings me to your question of the Melkites. Why? Because people were scared of Paul and were also scared of a gospel which was so almost identical. I mean, the wording is 95% identical with the wording of Marcion's gospel. The only difference, with a few exceptions, is that Luke has a birth story of Jesus and the ascension at the end. But the rest of the text, with a few exceptions, as I said, are literally identical. So my reading of that is that one did not choose, consciously, one did not choose an apostle's name, but the name of a student. And one did not even take the name of a student who was a student as an apostle. But as the early Christians rightly say, and as the redactors of our New Testament, now he comes back to chapters which are not known before Irenaeus, so which belong to the redaction of Irenaeus, like Colossians 4, where Mark is being introduced together with Luke as one of the collaborators of Paul. Acts then introduced Mark as a collaborator of Peter. So now comes our Melkite question to finish. The two gospels that are most closely related to Marcion's gospel is Luke, because of the wording, and Mark, because it lacks the birth stories and the ascension. And these two gospels were not worthy to be called after an apostle, but were only given the names of students of apostles, to have a clear authority difference. Tertullian gives us this authority difference. He says, Marcion must have been a maniac because out of these four gospels, he has chosen the worst one, the least possible one. Luke, he says, is not an apostle. He is the student of an apostle. But he is not the student of a real apostle. He is the student of the least and the last apostle, namely Paul. Paul, who Acts says is no apostle whatsoever, because he doesn't belong to the people who have seen Jesus as a historical person. And so you can see, Tertullian knows about this kind of a hierarchy. And to avoid the proximity and to have this hierarchy where Matthew is the most important gospel together with John, and these are the gospels that Irenaeus then makes most use of, Tertullian makes most use of, all the others make most use of. So you can see there's a clear relation to put Paul and the gospel related to him, because it was a student who wrote it, apparently, is of a secondary nature. So Paul was a problem. Peter was slightly better. The problem with Peter, of course, was Peter was not unambiguous either, as we can see from the gospel narratives, but still he becomes more and more famous. And, even particularly with Matthew's gospel, we are told he is the rock foundation of the community.
Okay, Gnostic Informer, I see your super chat, brother. I'm going to ask one more, and then if we could dive into supers, that'll be great. So I really appreciate your time here. So that we're clear, this is a bit messy, clearly, for the viewer. So that I understood you properly earlier. If you don't mind, how do you draw a line? If I gave you a graph or a timeline, and I said, okay, put these texts in chronology of when you think they may have been written. Now, this is difficult with Paul.
No.
So it's not. Okay, so then help us out. Go from the beginning, which books you think came first. And I know that some of this is going to be speculative. That's okay. Some of it you're pretty much...
Look, I hate speculations, right?
Okay. So Mark.
I hate speculations. So the first attestation of Paul's letters is the Marcionite collection. Everybody agrees to that. We don't have any evidence for anything else.
We only have allusions, right? Like
exactly.
Clement,
in that collection of Marcion, we have two collections of which he borrowed. Yeah. So these must be earlier. Marcion's collection, from all the witnesses we have, were put together around the end of the Second Jewish War. So we are in the year 135, between 135 and 140. So pretty precise, no speculation.
Okay.
At this time, we have two collections of Paul which are prior. How long prior? Speculation.
Got it.
No, we don't know. The three letters that we have come from the similar people who also are linked to the redactors around Irenaeus. Of course, there's a gap of at least one generation. So it must have been within a school. And I guess it's to do with Polycarp's school, because Polycarp seems to be involved. He knows Paul, he knows the letters. So he was going on. He trains Irenaeus. So that's the trajectory. That happens around the mid of the 2nd century to 170. Irenaeus was very young at the time. He tells us in a letter that he sit at the feet of Polycarp, who was an old man. So here we have got the trajectory. So again, we start 135 to 140. The 10 letters are known. 3 of them come from this area of Polycarp, Smyrna, Eastern Asia. The 7 letters we don't know. Where that collection comes from, we have no idea. If I had to guess, Marcion was a navigator or a ship owner, and if I see from the addressees of the 7 letters, they are almost exclusively letters to ports. Corinth is a port. Rome is a port, or it's got a port at least, yeah. Mm-hmm. Philippi is a port. So Thessaloniki is a port. So we have port cities. The only letter which doesn't go to a port city where no sea is around is Galatians.
Right.
Galatians is the neighbor area where Marcion comes from. My guess is that because he was a ship owner, he had a friend, colleague, or he himself, I don't know, brought together the collection of these 7. That indicates at least the locations and the addresses. Yeah. But how old these letters are, how old the collections is, whether it's done by Marcion himself or a related colleague from the ship industry, I don't know. This is speculation now, yeah?
Yeah.
So before 135, it's a black box. We have indications with the addresses, we have indications with the style of the letter of the three, that they belong to the canonical reductors, that we can see. So that's what we know. Earlier, now comes the question, do we believe that behind the three there is a Paul? Maybe there is one, because a name, as I would agree with you, the reductors may have borrowed and put these three letters, the Deuteropaulines, in the name of a known authority in the community.
Right.
That makes sense to me.
It may not be the case, but yeah, it makes sense to me. Okay.
The seven letters, maybe the collector of these seven letters had the same intention and also put these names, if he has written it or she has written it, it might be that the letters were artificially written, because there are still signs, Nina would say, that there are literary texts and not letters. So even if they are fictional letters, they might have been credited, like the three, which I think are also fictional letters, they might have been credited to a historical person from the 1st century. Whether these letters were ever written in the 1st century, we don't know. We can now, you can say no, I can say yes, you say yes, I say no. So speculation. Further research might bring us a bit further, but that's something we need to wait for.
How do we address the Gospels then? You've addressed the letters of Paul.
Gospels is exactly the same situation. We have one Gospel, which is the predecessor of the canonical Gospels. These canonical Gospels, as Tertullian tells us, Marcion complains in his preface to his New Testament, were, as he says, plagiarisms of his Gospel.
So Mark, Luke, and Matthew would have been technically derivatives, the Luke we have, derivatives of the original, you're saying, Marcionite Gospel.
Yeah, whether Marcion, again, if he borrows letters from collections, he might also have borrowed collections for his Gospel, maybe Gospel collections, I don't know, which opens up an avenue to say, well, there could have been a pre-Marcionite Gospel, which he makes use of, potentially. But because the Gospel has such a Marcionite voice, just as Paul's letters now in his collection have a very similar style, have some same language, my guess is that the reductor has heavily impacted both the Gospel and the 10 letters.
So this would solve my problem with Mark. If you said Mark came later.
Mark is a derivative of this Gospel.
Got it. Okay.
And that's why that's one of the reasons why not just yourself, but a recent scholarship, and it's not just one scholar, it's several scholars that claim the proximity of Mark to Paul. I would even say there's a proximity between Mark and the Marcionite collection. That's one of the reasons why Mark, for example, doesn't have a birth story, doesn't have an ascension of Christ, and why Mark was not put under the name of an apostle, but just under the name of a student of an apostle. So it's already a mediation, by highlighting Matthew and John and reducing the power of Mark and Luke.
What do you do with Papias at this point? Because people always will go to Papias and say 110s. He's saying there's a Mark, there's two Matthews. How do you deal with that?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I've dealt with Papias all my life. Yeah, it was my first MA thesis on Papias, so it's long ago. But also, I've altered a bit my views since then, because in Papias it's quite clear, no mention of Luke
or John, right?
No, John. We have a preface. We have a Latin text that gives us a report about Papias talking about John.
Okay.
Which is quite often neglected just because it's not in Eusebius.
That's what I had never heard that. So okay.
Oh, that we should talk about it, because
that was new.
This is a very important section, because it is in one of the prefaces which we find in many, many manuscripts in the Latin West. So it's very widespread. But it is a preface to the Gospel of John taken from Papias. And here Papias is supposed to say that while John was alive and that he has written the Gospel, there was an exchange because Marcion went to see him. And they had a debate about Gospel writing. And after having read the preface of Marcion, the antithesis, John reckoned that his Gospel is truer than Marcion's. The people who have published this text in the 19th century and in the 20th century, they had replaced the name of Marcion with other names, Serdo and God knows what. You know why? Because they were saying it's an anachronism. It's impossible that Papias says Marcion was in exchange with John, because that would put John in the 130s or 40s. Now, all our manuscripts, and we have many, all our manuscripts exclusively have no variant on the name of the person Marcion. All of them give us Marcion.
Just so I understand you, Papias is saying Marcion's name.
Yes.
And that, wouldn't that push him into the post-Bar Kokhba period, though, instead of dating him in the 110s?
And that's the reason why they were exchanging the name against all manuscript evidence. It's historical nonsense. It's making up your evidence.
I mean,
not long ago, when I was talking to somebody, a very respected New Testament scholars, who writes a commentary on the Gospel of John for over 20 years, and we had lunch, we had dinner together, and he admitted to me, just like you, that he had never read this text by Papias.
I didn't. I only knew of the Eusebius, account.
Like him, but you don't write a commentary on John. Anyway.
Yeah.
So,
I might need to know that before I try to. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So here we are with Papias. Yeah. So he knows of John, he knows of Matthew, and he knows of Mark. Now, why don't, you could say, well, by chance, we don't have any information about Luke. Let's take what he says about Mark. He's pretty unhappy with Mark because he says he translates Peter's message and he gets the order wrong. And he needs Matthew to restore the order. So Matthew for him, just as with Tertullian, what I mentioned before, Matthew is the higher one, Mark is the problematic one.
Right.
On Luke, he doesn't have anything to say, or we don't have it. The same authority structure that we had before. Mark is a problem. Now, what we can say about Matthew, he even increases, I think, the authority of Matthew and the age of Matthew by saying, oh, this was written in Hebrew. So it gives him more age, and with age, more authority.
Do you think there was a Hebrew Matthew, or you think that was he's saying that to make it a better gospel or more antique, so to speak? What are your because I hear it's mentioned in other sources too. There are some other. Indeed,
I'm just studying this famous book from 2010 on the Hebrew Gospel, right? And I think the last word hasn't been said there. It could have been, yeah. Why not? We have Hebrew-speaking Jews. Why wouldn't they have written something in Hebrew? Yeah. I don't know. I haven't got the final answer on that. I need to do more research on that because I was a bit busy with our nice friend Paul over the last years. So I've done a bit more on Paul than I've done on the Hebrew Gospel. But this is a question which I think can be raised. And when I said the collector of the 10 letters makes use of collections, why would he not make use of another earlier collection also with regards to Gospels? Which of the Gospels, again, I think needs a bit of further research.
Wow. Okay. You really, You really made me, go, holy moly, I've never heard of this. I really haven't heard this. I've kind of been coming from the standard model, and I'm called radical for, and it's like they haven't even, I don't even think they have a clue about the research you're doing. And are you seeing change, or are there people who are getting on board within academia on some of these ideas?
Oh, loads.
Loads.
Yeah. Look, we have been asked, Nina and myself, we are invited for a book discussion of my book, Resetting the Origins of Early Christianity, where I show that from the year 1000 onwards, backwards, Christian authors were rarely interested in the historical questions. Yeah. So when they make use of these texts and make claims about authorship, date, and whatever, it is for the apologetic, for propaganda purposes, not for historical purposes. Yeah, it's a novel question. So I wrote a book on early Christianity by moving backwards from 1000 to 200. Yeah, it's Resetting the Origins of Early Christianity, published with COP. Yeah, it's the left one. On the left side. That's the one. Yeah. And this book, together with Nina's book, is going to be discussed in a seminar at the upcoming SBL, Society of Biblical Literature conference, the biggest conference in the world that we have every year in New Testament studies and related subjects. And this time it will be in Boston. And so if you are interested, if you want to come along, we will discuss Nina's book side by side with this book. And anybody who is interested, here we are. And,
wow. And this is affordable too. I mean, clearly it's difficult. Some of the more pricey ones are coming from academic publishing companies, but this is a much more affordable.
$30 odd dollars, I think, for a substantial hardbound copy.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you don't. No. I will have another book with COP coming out in summer, which I've just sent off actually today with the final proofs, which is called Challenge, or The Challenge of Writing Early Christian History, which is more a book on the methodology, how to write early Christian history, but it might be of interest to you as well.
Absolutely. I want to talk to you more about each of them. I would like to read them before I jump into, or get some of them digested at least. I like to come in with some awareness of the topic, not just wing it, even though I could wing.
You know so much. Come on.
Yeah, look, but
this
you know
is
what
another
I mean.
thing, because I have never taken the view that people like yourself are lay people. On the contrary.
Yeah.
I mean, I get so much out of the questions you ask, and you have such a broad knowledge. Like Jacob Berman and others, right? I admire this type of scholarship.
I really appreciate it. Yeah.
It's like, if I may just add, it's like those substantial questions that the viewers are asking. They are most learned, and I'm not just surprised. No, it takes me a step further in my reflection.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Feels good to hear that. We are putting a lot of hard work into this. I don't claim to be an expert in anything except communicating and getting the best out of my guests. So I am that. And
in this, I join you. I'm not an expert in anything. I mean, we have so many black boxes where we have no clue. Yeah. No clue.
Let me ask you this. This was one of the pressing questions, and then we'll get to supers. Sorry that I'm pushing this so long, but there's so much more I know we need to explore and to think through together for our audience to understand where you're coming from. I asked Nina Livesey, if Paul's letters, all of them, let's just say, are written after Acts, but the letter collection that we find within Marcion, and you pointed out there's 3 and then there's 7. What kind of theology is Marcion's letters of Paul teaching, and are those 3 deutero trying to do something completely different from the 7 that you would say Paul that were not canonical, not the redactors touched them text, but what is Marcion's Paul? Is he Gnostic? Is he more like what we would call a Gnostic? Is he a a Pharisaic Gnostic. How would you categorize, and what are some of the teachings in there? Because I read weird stuff like, the law was given by angels, mediators, not directly from God, or you even get these kind of hints at like evil creator kind of stuff in some of these. Even in the Gospel of John, you get hints at stuff like this. But how do you deal with the question of how would we understand Marcion's Paul theologically?
Okay, I probably would not jump on the title Gnostics, not because I don't think he is or he isn't, just because I think the title Gnostic has a negative touch to it. Okay. Although people like Clement of Alexandria claim from themselves that they are Gnostics. Yeah. So I'm a bit skeptical about, because the name Gnostic in the 20th and 21st century has become such a negative label.
Of course, you're right.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's anachronistic, because people like Clement of Alexandria, who clearly is a mainstream theologian for people today, has no hesitation, in saying he is himself a Gnostic, nor does he have hesitations in quoting Gnostic literature, purely Gnostic literature. So I'm not against the title. I'm just avoiding it for that kind of a particular reception of the title in our times.
I'm glad you're explaining this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I prefer to call most of the Gnostic people, including Clement, and also Marcion, I would call a middle Platonist. What is a middle Platonist? These people were readers of Plato, but also integrated some Aristotelian logic and also some Stoic notions of the cosmos. We don't need to go into detail, right. But it's a bit of a mixture of philosophy, but Plato plays a big role. Another very important person I would call a middle Platonist, and I'm not the only one who would call him a middle Platonist. So a similar think structure and theology is the Jew Philo of Alexandria. Now, Philo lives from about 40 before our era into the times of Jesus. And he plays an important role for people like the Gospel of John. But he also plays a big role for people like Marcion.
Right.
And much of what I'm now saying was a belief which you find in the 10 letters, not just in the 7, but in the 10 letters of Marcion's Paul, is reflective of the belief of Philo. I give you one example, and I start with Philo and not with Marcion's Paul. Philo believes that our creation, our body, our physical environment, so our earth or our universe, has not been created by the Jewish God. Namely, not by the creator. Why? He makes a difference between the Jewish God Yahweh, who he thinks is an absolutely transcendent God. And this he maintains with all other Middle Platonists, be they Greeks, Christians, Jews, anybody who believes in this kind of Platonic thinking believes in a transcendent God. And this transcendent God has no dirty hands. Yeah. He doesn't spit to create something. It's purely knowledge, as in Plato. So the first creation is as he calls, a noumenal, an ideal creation. It's just ideas, nothing physical. And Philo says this you can read in Genesis.
Right.
Because Genesis has 2 stories of the creation. One is the 7 days. And you don't see that God messes around with bones or with women or with
clay,
earth, clay, nothing. This is the description of the ideal cosmos. And he says on the first day, this is the utmost important part of that creation. Everything has been created because it's all ideas. So it's Platonic. And then comes the second story. And here he says, it's no longer this divine. It's only the hands of the divine. It's the powers of the divine. And this divine has two powers that can mess around with this world. Namely a logos and a sophia, a word and a wisdom, a male and a female. And you can see how close that is to Christian thinking. You have almost the Trinity in there. And then people come along, and Marcion is one of them, who has the same distinction between the absolutely transcendent God. And that's the God who, according to Marcion, he is now a messianic Jew, not like Philo. That makes the difference. And for him, this utterly transcendent God has sent the Messiah. He then invents, and maybe he's the one who has invented it, or he has borrowed it from somewhere, I don't know, I haven't found anybody else who has believed in a similar thinking, but he believes that this God's power, the Logos, the demiurge, who has created this bloody cosmos with death and illness and wars, that this demiurge also wanted to send a Messiah. And he takes, just like Philo, who says, the story about our transcendent God, God Yahweh, is only the Torah, the beginning, the first chapter of Genesis. Marcion expands that and says, the entire story which comes after that, so all our Jewish Bible is only a story about the Logos, the demiurge, the creator of this bloody mess. And that's why we have Cain and Abel, we have murders. This God drives the Pharaoh into death, hundreds of thousands of deaths. Hence also his Messiah, like in the book of Daniel, he kills the princes in order to get the things right. Hence this Messiah of the demiurge cannot be our Messiah. Christ is the Messiah of the transcendent God. Now you see, it's not so far away.
Right.
And Justin Martyr, just to take then another middle Platonic thinker, he makes the differentiation slightly different. He says, no. You've got it wrong. You read Philo wrong. No. The transcendent God is the creator. The difference, however, is that the Jews are reading the whole thing wrongly. So he tries to integrate and says, well, no, the difference we have to make between how the Pharisees and how the Jews read and interpret their Bible. And they can't do it because only we can read them. So he makes the distinction somewhere else, but still a distinction. It's a distinction between some kind of Jewish interpretation and some others. So back to Marcion, and to get that straight, he believes in a transcendent God, in one God. And he believes that a lower power of a divine create this messy world. And that's why the whole story in the Jewish Bible and the Jewish scriptures do not belong to the Christians, but belong to the people who believe in this God with this creation and this Messiah. That's why we need a new creation and why we need a New Testament. And now comes with the second difference. The New Testament for Marcion has nothing to do with the Old Testament, nothing at all. We are not inheriting this bloody cosmos. Christians, he says, are inheriting nothing but the transcendent kingdom. Just as God is divine, the creation is divine, so is our future divine. And that's why in Luke's Beatitudes, which he borrows from Marcion's Gospel, we have that the poor are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And we have heard before that Marcion's Paul says twice, once in Galatians, once in 1 Corinthians, that the flesh is not inheriting the kingdom of heaven. Flesh, is creation. That's bloody lust. unless it's transformed into spirit. And then it is spirit. And here you see that there is what we then quite often call Gnostic, because the physicality has no bearing. And that's why he also says we better are ascetics, because if we continue producing offspring like you have done and I have done, we are the bloody idiots, because then we have to suffer. Either they lose their dads or mums, or we losing our kids. Why should we engage in suffering? No, we have to transcend this world. That's their solution. But that's a solution, I don't think, because we would be pretty soon no longer existing as human beings. That's why I think this was, in a way, a non-starter for a new religious movement. But then, around this world, we have monks and nuns and ascetics. So there is an appeal to this type of asceticism, which does not want to engage in these forms of suffering into which you and me engage. Because I've lost my wife, I have 2 kids, we are losing. We're having things, but we're losing.
Right.
Ascetics don't lose anything. If you haven't got an offspring, you don't lose an offspring. So whether that's a solution for life is another question. But that's the theology. That's Marcion's.
It sounds like you're entering into the Cynics versus Stoics debate, even.
In a way.
In a way, the Cynics were like, we don't want anything. We don't even care about shoes.
Exactly. So this is the debate. It's not nonsensical. There is a rationale behind which people follow still today, but it was not a token to create a world religion. And therefore, I think there is a distinction between the 10 letters as we have them in Marcion and the canonical letters which allow for marriage. But the difference is also in the Marcionite collection, he has equal rank for women as he has for men. Which the canonical reductors don't have. And interestingly, in the 3 letters that are from the canonical tradition, I think, in Marcion's collection, there's the only verse there where there is mention of women who should subjugate to men. So as he left the wrong back reference, he also left that one verse, which shows he has some respect for the texts he makes use of. He does redaction, but I think he also leaves stuff in, even if the stuff goes against his own views. A similar,
which is normal. I mean,
you make these mistakes, or you don't take care, or you have respect for a source, and you think, I may come up with a different explanation, but the text I leave.
Well, you get the same thing with. Imagine when we're reading the Gospel of John, there are some, I would call it, using their theology, heretical material that is in John right now.
Absolutely.
But Christians still adopt these texts. For example, the East might have a becoming divine, a Christian divination process, whereas those in the West and others do not adopt this idea. But John's gospel is so clear to me when he's like, may I be in you as you are in me, as I am in the Father, and you're in the Father, and I am in you. You're going to be divine just like me. It's so obvious.
At the same time, he says, you are higher than I am, right? So I'm...
Right. And there's so many interesting things you kind of wonder, what version of Christianity had that going on, Exactly. Anyway, I agree. There are so many things that I would love to dive into, and it's unfortunate because
we have more time at some point. We can reconvene at some point.
Please. I really
is there any open question on the questions that people have asked?
Well, I have some super chats, right?
Maybe we go through them and before we wrap up
things. Wade Rogers, thanks for being a member and for super chatting. We appreciate the help. Got to drop wife off at work, but wanted to send some love. Been hearing about this idea online for months now, and we'll watch this later. Thank you.
Well, that's not a question, but I hope your wife hasn't waited for too long. Be careful. Women are not patient.
Yes. Caleb Peterson, thank you for the super chat. Platonic Christian fire worshipers. And then there's the heart. Thank you. My unfinished journey. Thank you for the super chat. Hell Nero, Derek, and critical scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Caleb Peterson says, could Paul have any connection to Apuleius?
Wow, that is a good question. You know, I think that the Apuleius and other of these writings, were around, and we are not in a world where 1 million titles are being published every year. So my suggestion would be, it would be almost inconceivable if the writings even in various languages, because they were also translated, if these were unknown. So I think to deny a connection is more difficult to argue for than a relation between these writings.
Thank you so much. JC, again, is the day of small things related to Paul's name?
Yeah, do you know, Paul's name is a riddle. Derek has asked about Saul, and he's also mentioned the article that deals with this question of Paul and Saul, an article that argues even distinguishing between the king of Israel and bringing in some more contemporary stuff. Where the name has come from, good question. I've asked myself, but if you have an answer, I pay you $2.
Thank you, JC. S. Mill says, if Marcion's folks wrote 10 Pauline letters based on Acts, why doesn't Marcion include Acts in the first New Testament? He was nuts about Paul and included Luke, the first half.
Yeah, but maybe I expressed myself wrongly. I haven't said that Marcion's 10 letters were based on Acts. What I was saying is that the canonical redactors based their revision of Marcion's 10 letters, basing the revision on Acts. So that's why Marcion could not have, I think, he could not have included Acts because, as Harnack already suggested, he didn't know about Acts, and nobody before Irenaeus knows of Acts. Nobody deals with Acts. Nobody makes reference to Acts, but also there is no relation. And can you imagine all the stories that we have in Acts with all the personalities and all the people in Acts that we have, and they are never figuring in our literature before Acts? I think it's impossible. So that's why I think Marcion, it's quite clear. He's nuts about Paul, yeah? I don't think he includes Luke. I think it's the wrong way around. And maybe that's why the question is then a bit contorted, because as soon as you place, or as soon as you go along and believe in Irenaeus' statement that Marcion was redacting Luke, the whole thing is messed up. But don't forget that he claims Marcion has redacted Luke and abbreviated Luke. He has said first that the Valentinians have redacted the Gospels and wrongly interpreted them. So it's an applied argument which he rolls over from his opponents, Valentinian and Valentinus. He rolls it over to Marcion. So with all respect to my colleagues, I cannot believe any longer that Irenaeus got it right. I rather side with the scholars like Eichhorn already in the 18th century, who had studied the material and said, well, it is most sound to invert the relationship and to place Marcion first. I give you the last nice story. Even my good colleague, in the meantime, even friend, Matthias Klinghardt, when I had invited him because he wrote a paper in 2008 where, because of this Kafana Nazareth mistake in Luke, he thought about inverting the relation against Irenaeus and to say Luke is dependent on Marcion's gospel and not the other way around. I invited him in 2010 to the Oxford Patristics Conference. And there he stood making a big splash. I mean, he is a big boy and also a powerful man and a very serious man. And he made a big splash to say, Mark is the oldest gospel. And Marcus, you got it wrong. Look, I'm called Marcus, so I would have loved to have Mark as the first gospel. But I had settled on Marcion, who is the small mark, yeah? Maybe the redacted, or rather the infancy mark from which mark is being developed. Now, 4 years later, and Matthias has worked for 4 years on the reconstruction of Marcion's gospel. What was the result after 4 years intense study, having claimed in Oxford that Mark comes first? He comes up with a title. I've got the books here, but you can find them on the internet. The first gospel is the one he recreated or reconstructed, which is Marcion's gospel. The oldest
he's
gospel.
Changed his mind.
He's changed his mind because he has worked the material through.
Now, this is what I felt like. I'm not even saying that everything she's saying is right, because I'm not an expert clearly to gauge and to know. I'm just based on all that I'm hearing. But what I hear, Marcus, if you don't mind me bringing this point, is that I've interviewed quite a few scholars, Pauline scholars, Troll, Innsberg, Peterson, like lots of very interesting, smart people. Yeah. But it sounds like she's kind of breaking this trend that is just like, accept the 7. Nobody's really bucking against fighting the 7 or trying to think that did Paul really write these 7 and stuff. And she does it in a fun way. And in my mind, I thought, how many Pauline scholars really know about epistolary fiction on this level? How many Pauline scholars have done this? Right. And
I'll tell you, that's why I'm telling these stories, right? We are not people. I mean, we are not saying Nina or Matthias or others, right? We are not people who had some splashy ideas. No, we have worked our lives on this material, and in parallel, sometimes without knowing, like with Matthias, sometimes with knowing, like Nina quoting me, we after years of work, we have come to cautious, but on the other side, what people then call radical, I would say natural conclusions, right? And I would call today those people radical who build skyscraper hypotheses on datings of these texts, which are based on sand, on nothing. As soon as you dig into it, it disappears.
Wow. So the radical, and you're saying, let's change the tone here and take the more hypothetical scholarship that's doing all the hypothetical stuff and just granting the older models. They're really the ones who are holding to the radical position you're suggesting and not based on the scientific, the best argumentation.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. Scholarship today on Paul, to bring it to a nut, what I'm saying in the new book, which I'm publishing with Herder, I'm saying 99.9% of today's Pauline scholarship works on the collection of Paul's letters that is furthest away from a potential historical Paul.
Yeah, the ones we have technically today in our New Testament.
But this is the furthest away you can go. This is the fictional Paul. Whether there is a historical Paul behind, we still don't know. But if at all something comes closer to a potentially historical person, the scholarship today rests on legendary fiction.
Okay. Gnostic Informant, thank you for the super chat. Do you think it's possible that Christianity could be a reaction to 70 AD and thus going back to Jeremiah and Isaiah theology about a suffering Messiah?
The suffering Messiah, as Jewish and early Christian scholars say, is in existence at the time, but there is only a small trace of what we know about this type of the idea of a suffering Messiah in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So I couldn't exclude it, that it's going back. It could be a reaction to 70 AD, but for many reasons, I think there is more reason to believe that the reaction is rather to a experience of, let's say, 117 in the 2nd century, but more likely even of the Second Jewish War in 135. Why do I believe that? The problem is that we have Josephus, who talks about the War of 70. That's why we know more about the War of 70 than we know about the War of 135, because except for a few letters by Bar Kochba, we don't have any reporter about that war. Nevertheless, I think the results of that war cohere more with the reports in the Gospels that we have and in other literature that we have, like the Epistle of Barnabas and others. So I think there's more reason to believe that if a suffering Messiah, even with going back to Jeremiah and Isaiah, would cohere more with the experience of 135, maybe as a conglomerate, 70 plus 135. Why do I think that? In 70, not much has changed in Jewish practice. We have pilgrimages continuing, even like today, no temple, but pilgrimages are there. People every day, every morning, every evening go and pray to the walls of a non-existing temple. Just as it happens, I think, and we reckon, the high priest still continues, the Sanhedrin continues. So we have not a big change in Jewish life in Jerusalem. The drastic opposite will happen in 135. Why? Hadrian not only slashes the temple, but Hadrian exiles all circumcised men and the communities from Jerusalem. There's no Jew in the proper sense that's left in Jerusalem for hundreds of years. So this was the break. And to start reflecting on a suffering Messiah who hasn't achieved to bring back the temple. That was the time, I think, when only circumcised people were driven out and the uncircumcised Christians were able to remain. And as Eusebius says, if that's correct, for the first time, Christians then, they stay in Jerusalem. They elect an uncircumcised leader for the first time. So at that moment, I think, people started reflecting about the different nature of a Christian. And that's what happens in Marcion, a different Christianized form of Judaism than the Jews who had to leave, partly because they were seen as collaborators and workers, revolutionaries against Rome.
Sounds like Neil from Gnostic Informant needs to interview my friend here, Marcus.
Oh, with pleasure. I mean, look, I'm open for all the questions here. Please do.
Thank you.
If you come up with better answers, I'll be the first to embrace them.
Absolutely. JC, thank you for the super chat. Not sure if this is one that you'll be able to figure out being a Hebrew. Can the first become last, last become first tradition be traced to the, and I don't know this word, root in Ezekiel and Ishaman era? Is this why the Peshitta translated, and I do not know the language? I don't know.
Yeah, Scheffler. Well, look, it could be. Yeah, I'm not a specialist of the Jewish tradition of these writings, so I think we better ask somebody who is a specialist in the Jewish Bible. But in principle, I wouldn't exclude that from what I've read.
Thank you. And Libros del Pasado, thank you for the super chat. What is the relationship between the Second Sophistic movement and Paul?
Oh, brilliant question, because that is Nina's highlight, because I think I would say, not just Paul, I would say every Christian writing I know of has some kind of relations, even a closer relation that we think normally, with the so-called Second Sophistic. Now, what's the Second Sophistic for those viewers who haven't heard the word? It's partly a self-description of writers in the 2nd century, non-Christian writers. And why do they call themselves Second Sophistic? A, because they think they're a bit cleverer than the First Sophists. First Sophists are the people who have been slashed by Plato. And Plato was apparently superior to the First Sophists. Now, as I mentioned, we have a kind of a revival of Platonism in the times from the 2nd century before our era, and with Philo as one of the highlights in the 1st century before our era. And then it runs through to, I think, Plotinus, who then we no longer call Middle Platonist, but Neo-Platonist, because he was a star in that movement of a revival of Platonic ideas. And in that wave of a revival of Plato, we have also a revival of people who have been slashed by Plato. Yeah. And these people were partly Platonists themselves. So those are the sophists who, and it is lovely to read their stories because we have life stories of them and how they engage in getting the students to themselves and not to the neighbor, and how they slash then the neighbors. And we have people who are replacing other. I mean, this is a world of academia. And I believe the writings of Paul, as Nina rightly says, and the writings of Marcion are part of that kind of a school environment. People say that Marcion had a didaskalaion, a schoolhouse. Justin Martyr had a schoolhouse. Yeah, there were professional teachers who had also professions by the side to support them and to finance them. But there were professional teachers like those second sophists. And that's why the result of these works, like the Gospels, like Paul's letters, are so similar to the products that we have. And this kind of a joking about the competitors, you have in the 2nd century, we have so-called Lucian of Samosata, who is a sophist and who jokes about the Christians.
Yeah.
Not because he ridicules them. No, because he sees them as competitors. And he laughs about his neighbors. And so he laughs about Christian teachers.
Yeah. I always enjoyed reading his critique of Peregrinus Proteus.
Yeah, exactly.
And he talks about how this guy goes in and they practically worship him as a new Plato or a new Socrates. Sorry, Socrates.
Precisely. But Socrates is a big protagonist of Paul. So you see, it's a joke of people around a nice table. Yeah.
I love it, though. I love it. And he says that they're so gullible. He calls them, he mentions other people's dullards, but he's like, they're gullible. By the way, final question. We're done with supers, I believe. Okay. This is in the vein of Lucian. I think it's Lucian. No, Peregrinus. Someone argued that Peregrinus might have been one of these church fathers. I don't know if you know what.
Loads of people have said that.
Really?
And yeah.
Who's the church father?
Hermann Detering has written articles about it, but also my very good friend Jan Bremer has written at least 2 articles about Lucian and Peregrinus, and he shows that there are clear parallels, and he's a great scholar of religious history, so he shows the parallels between, for example, Ignatian, the 7-letter collection of Ignatius, and Peregrinus, that there is a clear interrelation between these writings. So we are at the end of the 2nd century. And you see, this is the environment of the canonical redactors. That's the bread and butter.
I love it. I love it. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, again, final plug. Get you a copy of one of the books that you can afford. This is Dr. Marcus Vinzent, ladies and gentlemen. He's digging into some stuff that we have more. We have to talk to him more about some of this material. You're writing a lot, and they can also follow you on Academia to get free downloads of some of the stuff that you've written.
Yeah, loads. Yeah, loads is for free there.
Lots of free stuff, and of course, get you a copy of the book so you can throw it at someone if they ever break into your house, because these are probably thick, I imagine, and it would work as a weapon. Final words from you, Dr. Vinzent. This has been fantastic.
Well, look, thanks so much for listening. I mean, we have kept you for 2.5 hours. Some have lost their wives, hopefully not. And I think if you hadn't had lunch, then please prepare it or get it from somewhere. I love to discuss with you. I love to engage with you. I love your questions, because what is a scholar? It's like in the 2nd century with the second sophistics. What's a scholar without readers and people to talk to and to listen to? And for me, I think I prefer even to listen than to talk. So I shut up now.
No, I like to listen I know sometimes I get carried away and excited. Feel like I have to articulate where I'm coming from and make sure everybody knows, but I really do appreciate all the knowledge that you're bringing. This is very interesting, to say the least. I mean, clearly it's not what I've heard from so many academics that I've interviewed, but there's a change I feel and see in the academic arena where people are starting to push things later and later and later. And some of those crazy people we thought were crazy may not have been so crazy at the end of the day. So thank you so much. Again, let's do this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody, don't forget, help support us. Go to the Patreon, become a YouTube member so your name has a special symbol next to it. It's the only way to enter through the 7 layers of heaven to get to the highest one. We love you. We appreciate you. Like it, share it, and never forget.
Thank you.
Are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.